we're back. We're going on a tour, and I just found out that this is the real ship.
U-505.
U-505.
All right, so just fill in anywhere you can find some space. We'll be a little bit crowded, but that'll be all the more authentic because there would have been a lot of guys in here.
Cool. This is where the torpedoes are. This one's flat.
Careful not to drop that phone back
Yeah.
there.
I know.
Yeah. All right, come on in. A little bit
We're
further
going
so I
back.
can close this airtight or watertight hatch.
Look at the better rooms.
Here's some other beds.
All right, welcome to the Petty Officers' Quarters of the U-505. Now, as you can see, we had to make a couple modifications for tour purposes. We had to cut these big holes for an entrance and an exit. That wouldn't work to have a huge hole on a submarine, but because we opened that up, we had to take the bunks out. That would have been on this side, so you'd see a mirror image and there would be beds all along this side as well. So the area to move around in is only as wide as this area I'm on. They lowered the floor about a foot. For the guys, in order to get on and off, they'd have to go through a round hatch and climb up or down a ladder. So, as I said, this is the petty officers' quarters. These were slightly higher ranked guys, and they were lucky because they had these little privacy curtains. This was a 24-hour-a-day operation, so there'd be activity going on all the time, and they did whatever they could to try to get some rest. These guys were also lucky, though, because they didn't have to share a bunk, but there were only 35 beds for 59 guys, so a lot of them did have to share. And if you'll take a look into that forward torpedo compartment there, you'll see that there are bunks right next to the torpedoes. That's where the enlisted men had to sleep, and they did have to share. They used a procedure called hot bunking, which meant that one guy would get out of the bed to go on his shift at work, and another guy would slide into that same bed to go to sleep. So it stayed hot, sweaty, and possibly lice infested too. So there were miserable things about being on a submarine, but it wasn't all bad all the time. They had time off, they played cards, they played chess, and they listened to a lot of music. When this was captured, they found a record player and 87 records on board. This is a recording of one of those records. It's French dance hall music, and it would have been completely outlawed by the German government at the time, along with all of French culture. But these guys liked it, they smuggled it on board and listened to it anyway, even though it was against the law. So, there were long periods of inactivity on a submarine like this, but when they spotted a ship, they would spring into action. They followed it at periscope depth during the day, then they would dive the boat and get ready to fire torpedoes at night. So the captain would ring the dive bell. And when that dive bell would go off, the guys would rush to their dive stations that they were assigned to all along the sides of the boat. They would open up the valves in a precise order that would allow water to rush into those ballast tanks, and it would help the submarine become denser in the water around them so they could submerge.
Creepy.
And then once they were submerged, the captain would start working on something called the firing solution. That was a complex mathematical calculation to determine exactly how to aim the torpedo to hit the target. So, what you're hearing now is the captain calling out those calculations in German to the men in the torpedo compartment so they can aim properly. No, baby. They would wait for the order to fire. Those. And then once the torpedo was fired, they just used a stopwatch to count the seconds because they knew, based on all the math they had done, exactly how long it should take for the torpedo to hit that ship. If they had silence at the end of that time, they knew they missed and maybe gave away their position. But an explosion meant to hit. In all, the U-505 sank 8 supply ships before it was captured. So we're going to continue the tour and talk all about the capture of the U-505 back in the control room. On the way there, though, you'll see some interesting parts of the submarine. First of all, on the left, you'll see the galley or kitchen. Imagine trying to cook for 59 guys in your kitchen at home. Well, this cook really had challenges because he only had 3 small hot plates in an oven about the size of a shoebox to cook for all those guys. Then we'll walk through the senior officers' quarters, which are a little nicer. And then on the left, again, you'll see the sound room and the radio room. That's where one of the Enigma machines was found.
Lights are
Those were
back
the
on.
machines the Germans were using to encode all their communications so their enemies didn't know their plans. And then you'll notice on the right the captain's bunk. So please stay to the right up this ramp and follow me to the control room.
So that, oh, cool. There's a kitchen.
So right up here is the conning tower, and that's where the periscopes would be in the first level up there.
I saw the periscope.
But it's dark right now, but yeah, and then above that is where a guy would be just with binoculars watching the horizon. So we just need to fill in anywhere on the green flooring. It's fine.
Hello.
Go forward some, Mama. Just fill in anywhere. You can find some room there. All right, so welcome to the control room of the U-505. This is the part of the submarine that controlled all of its motion. So right here we have the planesman stations, both electrical and manual controls for the dive planes. And that would determine whether the submarine went deeper or rose up to the surface. And that right there in the gray box is the electrical control for the rudder. It's the helmsman station, and that would control the rudder or the right and left motion of the submarine. So back to the story of the capture. In the days leading up to June 4th, 1944, a man on watch in the conning tower spotted a group of ships on the horizon, and he let the captain know. He called for a crash dive. The crash dive bell sounded like this. Now, when that bell would go off, the off-duty men would rush to the front of the submarine and get in a big dog pile on top of each other. That would add extra weight to the front so they could get a better angle and submerge more quickly. If everybody did their job right in a crash dive, they could get under the surface in less than 37 seconds. And every second counts when you're trying not to be seen. And then once submerged, they only had the battery power and the electric power they brought with them from the surface. So about 36 hours of each. So they had to conserve both. They would turn off all non-essential equipment, they would dim the lights, and they would send all those off-duty guys to their beds, hoping that if they went to sleep, they would use less oxygen and they would be quieter. Silence was key once they were down here, because the men all knew sound travels much faster and farther in water than it does in air. So a normal conversation like this or a dropped wrench could give away their position for miles away. So they would be down here in the dark trying to be silent. Oh, let's see if we can hear. But they would keep hearing this pinging sound. This is the sound of the active sonar coming from the American Hunter-Killer Task Group. They're sending out sound waves that bounce off of the outside of the submarine back to the source, and it helps the Americans figure out where exactly in the water the Germans are lurking. So if the pinging got louder and closer together in here, these men would know that their enemies were closing in on them. Imagine how those men would feel down here in the dark, knowing they were being hunted. How would you feel? So the captain might decide to whisper some orders to take them a little deeper to avoid their enemies. If he did that, they'd start to hear a groaning sound from the outside of the submarine under the pressure of the water too. So those two sounds would be ominous enough, the pinging and the groaning. But the worst sound of all would be splashes in the water, because that would indicate depth charges, huge bombs sent to explode at a certain depth. If they heard those, they would just hold on and hope for the best. That splash. So they would hold on. So the entire submarine would be shaken by these bombs. The men would be tossed around, equipment could get damaged. In this particular depth charge attack by the Americans, controls to the dive planes were wiped out. So they couldn't control their depth in the water any longer, and the rudder got jammed to the right. So So the U-505 started going in an uncontrolled spiraling dive, and it was getting closer and closer to its crush depth. At 755 feet beneath the surface, they would be crushed like a tin can and all the men would die. So Captain Harold Longa of the U-505 decided to save his men. He had them blow compressed air into the ballast tanks, and they popped up to the surface to take their chances there. The captain and two of his men went up the conning tower to assess the situation. They found out they were completely surrounded. They were hit with 6 minutes of machine gun fire at that point. One of the men who went up with the captain was killed immediately. He was the only casualty in this capture, and the captain was hit with shrapnel in the knee, so he was injured on deck. He realized it was hopeless. He called down and told the men, abandon ship and sink the boat on purpose so the Americans couldn't capture her. So all the Germans began to leave, but one of them took the cover off of something called the sea strainer. It's a round opening to the ocean in the floor, and it let water rush in. So they were hoping to sink the boat that way. Then after all the Germans left, an American boarding party came on, and luckily one of the American sailors put that cover back onto the sea strainer and stopped the flooding. Then they gathered up all the classified documents they could find, and they really wanted to get control of the whole submarine, so they needed to get to the manual control of the rudder to stop it from spinning on the surface. So we're going to be walking in the very footsteps of that brave American boarding party who got on here not knowing if it would sink or explode at any time. So please stay to the right there. You'll notice that sea strainer on the left as you leave this room, and I'll meet you in the electric motor room. That's the sea strainer. So water was gushing in. Luckily, they left the cover right there. So you can see. Is that you can still smell that diesel fuel from 77 years ago. It's still in here because of those diesel engines. And that smell would have been much stronger, obviously, when it was running. And also the sound you heard was the sound of just one of those engines idling. If they were both on full blast, it would be really deafening back here, and the smell would be very strong. So, back to our story here. That American boarding party has headed on board. They have come back here, it's dark, they need to get control of that rudder, and they find a closed hatch. Well, a closed hatch on a submarine is a really bad sign, because it could mean there's flooding on the other side. If they were to open this, it could flood the whole boat and sink it. They also were very worried that the Germans might have set an explosive as a booby trap on this, so that if they opened it, it would explode and sink the boat. So they didn't know what to do. They called Captain Dan Gallery, who decided he didn't want to give a dangerous order he wasn't willing to carry out. So he personally boarded the U-505, came back here, sent the other guys out of this room, and dealt with this himself. He felt for wires and didn't find any, so he's hoping there's no explosive. And then he got a whole lot of courage to open the hatch. And when he did, luckily nothing happened. There was a small leak back here in the tiny bathroom on the left, because one of the pipes in there had burst during the depth charge attack. But they found some really interesting things. One of them was that the Germans were using a type of phosphorescent paint on a lot of the surfaces of the submarine. This was so that they could find their way to important equipment even if they lost power. The Americans did not have that technology yet, and they started using that paint on their submarines as well after this. They also found a couple of homing acoustic torpedoes back here. Those are like smart bombs, because after they're fired, they can adjust and change direction because they can hone in on the sound of a propeller they're trying to hit. So the Americans didn't have those yet either, and they learned a lot better how to defend against them from this capture. So you can see that big black wheel back there. That is the manual control for the rudder. Now you'll all have a chance to come up here and take a look inside this hatch. and we'll talk about the rest of the story. But please do not step inside this hatch. It is the 77-year-old floor back there. It hasn't been fortified like the rest of the flooring, and you could fall through. We don't want anyone to get hurt, but you could definitely come up, take some pictures if you like, and then we'll talk about the rest of the story. After the Americans got control of this, we'll talk about what happens next, right outside the submarine down the stairs. Okay, watch out, Peyton. Mama's gonna get a picture. Hold on, baby. That's the original floor, honey. So it will fall through. That's where they slept. That's where they went night-night. See, they're waiting. Come on, you gotta let other people see. Come on.
Is that the bathroom?
Yes, baby.
You can go.
30 million questions. Hold on. Yep.
Peyton, you can go.
Okay, come on, Peyton. He's asking like 30 questions.
Hey, don't drop my phone.
Bye guys, see you next time.